thinking, I wonder what's going on in there. Maybe it's too much estrogen. Well, what is estrogen and where did it ever come from or originate, and why do I have it in my body when I'm pregnant or before? Well, in 1929, Adolf Benedant and Edward Adalbert Dozy independently isolated and determined the structure of estrogen. Thereafter, the market of estrogen researching opened up.
The chemical formula for estradiol is C18H24O2. I did my model on estradiol.
Including the ovarian progestins and estrogens, especially progesterone and the testicular androgen testosterone, are all involved in the development and maintenance of primary and secondary reproductive tissues throughout the body. In addition to their primary effects, steroid hormones regulate in many other tissues throughout the body. For example, role in the development and maintenance of the female reproductive tract in men. The ovarian steroid, estradiol, is an important hormone of activity of cells in brain, bones, heart, liver, and fat tissue. Steroids exert their effects by altering cellular processes at many levels, including both short and long-term effects on protein synthesis, enzyme activity, energy metabolism, and cellular proliferation. These functions are critical to the maintenance of homeostasis in a healthy body. When steroid-modulated systems are not functioning properly, they are often associated with severe disease states, including sometimes cancer. Like all steroid hormones, estradiol circulates throughout the body via the vascular system and freely diffuses through membranes of cells in the body. In most cases, estradiol molecules travel through the cellular cytoplasm and then migrate into the nucleus, where the steroid exerts its major effects on cellular functioning. Steroid hormones, including estradiol, exert their effects by interacting with a special class of proteins called steroid receptors, found in the cells of target tissues. These receptor proteins have very specific binding properties and therefore associate with steroids and other chemicals in very particular ways. Estradiol and other estrogenic substances bind to the protein called the estrogen receptor. Although estradiol binds and activates estrogen receptors in both the cellular membrane and the cytoplasm, most of its sustained effects on cellular functioning are the result of its interactions with estrogen receptors in the cell's nucleus. In the absence of estradiol, estrogen receptors are distributed throughout the cell nucleus. These receptor proteins are large, complex structures that include a pocket called the ligand binding domain, into which estradiol will eventually bind. In the absence of estradiol, receptors are associated with a large cluster of proteins called chaperones that serve to keep the receptor in the correct conformation to allow estradiol to approach and bind to the ligand binding domain. When estradiol enters the nucleus and begins to interact with the receptor, the chaperone complex dissociates from the receptor and estradiol binds to the exposed ligand binding domain. As a result of this interaction, receptor complexes form clusters within the nucleus in the region of the chromatin.
Although it has recently been discovered that estrogen does perform changes at the cell membrane, the major action of estrogen is through its cytoplasmic receptor. After estrogen binds to the estrogen receptor, the complex then migrates to the nucleus of the cell. Once inside the nucleus of the cell, the estrogen and estrogen receptor complex bind to the DNA and thus activate genes. Human genes are off until they are turned on, and one of the primary ways of turning on a gene is to have the appropriate proteins bind to it. So thus estrogen bound to its receptor activate genes by physically binding to the DNA. Many of the proteins activated by estrogen promote cell division. Some mutations that promote cancerous growth are such that cells express estrogen receptors when they are not supposed to. When estrogen is in the blood, it commands certain cells to divide. And if mutant cells express estrogen receptors, they will then respond to the presence of estrogen and divide when they should not. Such a mutation could make the development of cancer more likely. While most breast cancers are estrogen dependent, at least at the beginning, they require the hormone estrogen in order to thrive and grow. Ultimately, many of them become estrogen independent and continue to divide even when estrogen is not present. Very often how this occurs is through mutations in estrogen receptors, so that the receptors are always activated. Usually, estrogen receptors are only activated and only turn on genes when they have bound the hormone estrogen. But certain mutant receptors have the ability to bind DNA and turn on genes even when they have not bound estrogen, and so they may continually tell cells to divide even when estrogen is absent.
The same source and published in the Journal of the American Medical Association focuses on women who've had hysterectomies and as a result used only estrogen. It found some benefits, including a reduced risk of breast cancer, and said the risk of stroke declined.
What are the 2 or 3 main hormones?
The main hormones that you think of when women talk about their hormones are estrogen and progesterone.
So estrogen and progesterone. What does the estrogen do for a lady?
Well, estrogen has many effects, and estrogen is actually a class of hormones, and there are several, actually 3, that are produced in a woman's body.
So you can't just say estrogens.
That's
you've got
right.
a lot.
It's a little more complex than that.
But from the patient standpoint, what does an estrogen do for that patient?
From a patient standpoint, the primary role of estrogen is to it's actually a class of hormones, and there are several, actually 3, that are produced in a woman's body.
So you can't just say estrogens.
That's
you've got
right.
a lot.
It's a little more complex than that.
But from the patient standpoint, what does an estrogen do for that patient?
From a patient standpoint, the primary role of estrogen is to cause ovarian function.
Now, ovarian function, what's that mean?
The ovarian tissue is what a woman has that develops and ovulates, produces an egg each month. So the primary function of these hormones during the reproductive years are to allow a woman to become pregnant.
So does the estrogen do anything to her skin or her personality?
Well, it does. There are actually estrogen receptors throughout the body. So estrogen has effects on the brain, on mental function.
Do I need some estrogen?
Well, it does. There are actually estrogen receptors throughout the body. So estrogen has effects on the brain, on mental function.
Do I need some estrogen?
Well, you have some actually, small amounts.
That's right. Does the brain work better with estrogen hormones?
Well, we know that it plays a role in mental function, but it's confusing as to what that role is and which stages of life.
And what else does it do for a lady to make her pretty?
Well, it has effects on the skin.
What kind of effect?
It affects the collagen makeup or the elasticity of the skin.
So it makes the skin smoother and makes the lady prettier that way. Would that be correct?
You could think of it that way, yes.
Any other main purposes?
Well, it plays a role, if you think about it, puberty, in making a girl appear more like a woman. So it plays a key role in breast development, in menstrual function, so starting to have periods.
Lock and key mechanism by fitting into the receptor so the same message is sent to the body. Estrogen mimics can be found in many products we use every day. Birth control and hormone replacement therapy often contain synthetic estrogen. Atrazine is a commonly used herbicide that mimics estrogen. Bisphenol A is an estrogen mimic used in the polycarbonate plastics that make up many of our food and water containers. Triclosan is a major ingredient in antibacterial soap that is also an estrogen mimic.